Thank you again for being here with us this evening. I'll introduce myself. I'm Chuck Fale with National Review, and I want to thank everyone with Tikvah who's partnered with us with this event on. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you tonight. Tonight's discussion will cover the anti-Semitism of our nation's past and the tragic increase of anti-Semitism today. William F. Buckley taught us much throughout his life, but how to confront and root out anti-Semitism is one of the most significant. He dedicated the entirety of the December issue of 1991 of National Review to his essay In Search of Anti-Semitism. Amongst the considerable response was a criticism that he failed to define what anti-Semitism is. And so when it was published as a book several months later, he included one respondent's definition, writing, "Anti-Semitism was different. It has different energy levels and could be defined as a dislike or disapproval, A, even of Jews one has never met, and B, of any corporate objectives identified as of special concern to prominent and vociferous Jews." Buckley called this a form of casual anti-Semitism. Having served in World War II, Buckley knew that such casual anti-Semitism, like all insidious values, leads to greater destruction. He saw that the first tool of those whose aim truly is genocide is the perpetuation of ignorance and the propagation of lies. He recognized, like so many in this room have, that the way to halt this casual anti-Semitism path is to expose it. He wrote, "It is inevitable that the poisoned wells that generated Auschwitz should continue under microscopic scrutiny by those who do not understand but seek to do so. How the anti-Semitism of the 1920s and 30s, largely social and cultural, metastasized into the Holocaust. Microscopic scrutiny of the failings of the 1920s and 30s is needed in many areas of our policy and culture today. But tonight, we're focused on its most evil failing. Buckley's efforts to bring this level of microscopic scrutiny to anti-Semitism was not limited to this post-Gulf War moment. This was a cause that Buckley advanced throughout his life. He ensured the National Review would root out anti-Semitism. In 1957, he determined that no writer who appeared on the masthead of the anti-Semitic right-wing journal American Mercury could also appear on ours, which Norman Podhoretz, among many other scholars, cited as a seminal moment in the cleansing of anti-Semitism from the American right. While much of his work in opposition to anti-Semitism is aimed at its elimination from the conservative movement in America, he did point to anti-Semitism as the root of Islamist hatred towards Israel as well. In 1979, in Iran, when the Ayatollah Khomeini seized power, Buckley had a special episode of Firing On it, entitled The Rising Tide of Islamism. His guests were three Islamic scholars. The conversation led to a column in National Review that discussed the hostility towards Israel and the Jewish people. They asked, why is there greater hostility to Judaism than other infidels? Their answer was as accurate then as it is today. Islamist hatred of Israel and the Jewish people is because they have not only refused to submit to Islamic law, but continue to survive and thrive wherever Islamists have sought to eliminate or subjugate. Tragically, today, we are again seeing a rise of not only casual bigotry in American culture, but also its logical progression to hatred online, on college campuses, and violent attacks, even in our nation's capital, and against actual peaceful protests in Colorado. Wherever, whether it's radicals in Iran who chant death to America, along with death to Israel, to the pro-Hamas revolutionaries who burn American flags here at home, those who wish to do harm to Jews and to Israel ultimately want to bring down the United States and all of Western civilization. Tonight, our panel will elaborate on Buckley's work, but also help bring his microscopic scrutiny to today's anti-Semitism. This moment in our nation's culture heightens the need for and importance of Tikvah's work. But on behalf of National Review, please let me express my deepest gratitude to Tikvah and everyone involved with it for their excellent work. In fighting anti-Semitism, their work in fighting anti-Semitism through serious education and scholarship on the meaning, history, and influence of Jewish civilization is even more important today. It goes hand in hand with their important work to bring understanding and enlightenment around our common principles, values, and beliefs. And again, in this work, Tikvah has alignment with National Review's founder. I'm going to conclude, and I want to get to our excellent panelists, with Buckley's conclusion to In Search of Anti-Semitism, including his quote of Proverbs 3. Religion has been abused in the past as a vehicle to justify alienation, but it is the light of the gospel of common brotherhood that mostly illuminates our bright belongings on earth. The single most powerful engine striving always to haul us up to a vision of equality was dispatched by him who made us, children of God with common ancestry. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind about thy neck, write upon them the table of thine own heart. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. Thank you to Eric. I really appreciate you and the entire Tikvah team for partnering with us tonight. And I thank you for the critical work. And I thank you for the panelists for the microscopic scrutiny that's been invited tonight. And with that, let me introduce, I don't think they need an introduction. I'm being told I need to introduce these folks. So Eric Cohen, CEO of Tikvah, Ruth Wisse, a fellow of Tikvah, Matthew Continetti of AEI and Free Press, and Haley Strack with National. And with that, I'm going to leave the stage and hand it over to you. Thank you.
Well, let me begin just by saying what a privilege it is to be involved in an event that honors the great William F. Buckley. I think, like so many of us, it was reading his essays and op-eds and writings as a young man that introduced me to the conservative way of thinking, to the importance of the conservative mind and the conservative movement. He was a man of unfathomable achievement, and one of those, of course, was dealing with this problem, the problem of anti-Semitism. In the book and essay that we just discussed, he tells an interesting story. That in the early 1940s, a Jewish young man was voted into a fraternity at Yale. And in protest, a bunch of the Yale frat guys burned a pig outside his door. Well, fast forward to the Ivy League campus today, and it seems like things have gotten a lot worse. We missed the good old days of just pig burgers, when anti-Semitism was a pathetic kind of social prejudice, as opposed to what it is now, which is an ideological assault on the Jews, to be sure, but at a much deeper level on America and on the West. And I think our mission tonight is to try to make sense of it, think about how to combat it, think about what we have to stand for as we stand against this terrible ideological virus. I have to confess that for many years, my tendency has been to downplay anti-Semitism, both because I believe that America is one of the great friends of the Jewish people, different than most of the other diasporas in Jewish history, and a place where Jews have flourished in freedom and liberty. And because I think it's incredibly dangerous for any organization, especially one that works with young Jews, to give in to the psychology of victimhood. The idea that we as Jews are just another color in the rainbow flag of needy victims, as opposed to proud, exceptional people that love our country and are proud of our own heritage. But I do think we are living in a different moment. Indeed, in just the last literally week, both my synagogue in White Plains and my kids' school in Westchester have put up security fences that make it feel like they're now going to school or going to worship at a compound. Wondering if we now impair results. It feels different, and what we need is the kind of moral clarity and lucidity that Buckley certainly offered in his day, and that Ruth Wisse, Matt Continetti, and Haley Strack will, I know, offer us this evening. So, Ruth, I'd like to turn to you first, and to turn to you in starting with Buckley. What is it that he saw in confronting anti-Semitism in the early 90s. What was that political and ideological moment, and why was his voice so important?
I must say that this is a wonderful occasion for me to rediscover Bill Buckley, because unlike the children among whom I find myself, I was really quite of age already when Bill Buckley came on this subject and came on the scene. And I was an avid reader of commentary, of course, so I came across Bill Buckley from the commentary side. And it was wonderful. The only thing I can compare it to today is Douglas Murray. And you know what that is. It is somebody who comes from outside and who discovers your problem and who seizes that problem and who's better than you are at speaking about it, because he's speaking from his own perspective to his own audience and takes it very seriously. So coming back now and reading all of this from the beginning, the essay itself, it was alluded to, right, and all that followed, because this book is quite interesting. What he does is he gives you all the whole argument. And here's one thing to be envied in relation to what Eric was just saying. How enviable that this whole conversation that he lays out in this book, what a level is that? I mean, the arguments are fierce, and some of them are not what you want to read. But everybody is speaking with dignity, with seriousness. Everybody knows what they're talking about. So that was in itself very done. Let me just get to the Buckley, though. What so moved me about it is not to sort of encounter that. He was entirely himself in a way that I don't know how many people really are. He knew that he was extremely intelligent, and he wanted to be extremely intelligent, to be known as extremely intelligent, to live at that level of intelligence. He was elegant. He loved elegance. Everything about him was elegant, and he never deviated from that. And to find a person who is deep in what he is in itself quite exciting. But here's the thing: when he discovered anti-Semitism, and he discovered it sort of retroactively in his own family, he tells us that his father was an anti-Semite. And as you say, you know, in college, he met many people who had anti-Semitic ideas. He began to realize that anti-Semitism exists. What happened is interesting. He didn't give up religion. He didn't say, oh, this is horrible. All these Catholics are anti-Semitic, so I'm going to become a liberal. He didn't do that at all, which is the temptation of so many people. What they found wrong in their family and their back, they go to the opposite. He was clever enough to see that no, the opposite was perhaps even worse. So he was going to stay very much what he was, a conservative. What happened is that he decided that he had to get anti-Semitism out of conservatism. He wasn't going to give up conservatism. He was going to make sure that conservatism could not tolerate this within itself. And so he tackles it in a very personal way. And it's really a fight for him. He has to understand what it is. He has to understand why Joe Sullivan, who was a good friend, who was writing for him, a wonderful person, how come these people are calling him an anti-Semite? And when he goes and he looks at what they're pointing at, he sees, yeah, really, you know, this is not right. He should not be saying these things. Does that make him an anti-Semite? Is he an anti-Semite? He begins to grapple with it, and he makes sure, slowly but surely, that he fights it harder and harder. And really, it cost him himself and sure. I think many of us have experienced this. Mm-hmm. You have to lose friends. Sometimes you have to lose relatives. Many who don't speak to you because of differences of this kind. You really threw people out of the magazine he had created. He got a lot of flack from the people that he might have liked best, not that he was admiring. And that was really, to see that in action, really, I will say, I feel inspired by that. I will hold for the rest, though. When it comes to his idea of anti-Semitism, He didn't understand it fully, from my perspective. He tried as well as anyone else did. Does anybody? Well, I just have to confess to you that at the same time that this book was published, I published a book, which is going to be reissued actually, called The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews. If I'm not for myself, I wanted to just call it The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews. And guess what? It attacks exactly the same problem. It's so eerie. Exactly the same problem that he was struggling with. So you can imagine how emotional I was reading this book to see someone coming at it from his perspective, struggling with it from his perspective. And I was doing the same thing, but very much from a Jewish perspective. So it was very different, but I can tell you what an inspiration it is to be here under this joint auspices and to think of Bill Buckley and his life.
So, Matt, you're one of our great historians of American conservatism. Was Buckley successful? I mean, if we look at the situation today, as we look at the state of American conservatism and how it thinks about Jews, Israel, the problem of anti-Semitism, do we judge that Buckley's project worked, or are we worried?
Thank you, Eric. When you paid me that compliment, I realized I may be the only historian of conservatism. Like being the chief rabbi in Mecca, it's like the only profession that I try.
So was Buckley successful? He was for his time. So the American right emerges out of the Second World War. Really just different groups, libertarians, traditionalists, anti-communist hawks who want America to fight the Cold War. And it carried with it a certain reputation from the 1930s, the 1940s, the fight over American intervention in the Second World War, that had anti-Semitic overtones. And very quickly, Buckley discovers in the 1950s, he himself had been kind of de-radicalized from an anti-Semitic prejudice because of his experiences in the war, as Chuck mentioned, and also his experience at Yale. One of his closest friends at Yale was a Jew. So he actually included many Jews in the beginning of National Review. The distinction you have to draw, though, is that those Jewish journalists and political thinkers who became part of National Review usually came through Marxism and communism. So they were of a Jewish ethnic background, but the religious part of Judaism as a religious civilization was not there. But there were Jews involved at the beginnings of National Review and American conservatism. Buckley very quickly then decides that if you're a bigot, if you're writing bigoted things in other outlets, you're not going to be on the masthead of National Review, and eventually you're not going to be published in National Review as well. And so during his life and career, culminating in the book In Search of Anti-Semitism, I think Buckley did police the boundaries of his conservatism, mainstream American conservatism, represented by National Review very well. There's an asterisk to this story, though, which is that even while Buckley, again, from young adulthood on, was opposed to anti-Semitism, Israel, as a question, was still much debated in the early conservative movement. When National Review was formed in 1955, the Jewish state is about 7 years old. And some of those Cold War hawks that surrounded Buckley viewed Israel as a strategic liability, not an asset. The most important thinker in Buckley's kind of coterie, the thinker James Burnham, was a realist who just looked at it in sheer numbers and thought that Israel would be a drag on America. In one of the most important letters ever written to National Review, the German Jewish philosopher Leo Strauss wrote to the publication and said, "I don't understand why this magazine is publishing anti-Zionist articles that could be construed in many ways as anti-Semitic." And then he lays out very eloquently why Israel is actually a conservative project, why Zionism is a conservative project. And that kind of shows you how this debate was over the state of Israel, was overlaid on how Buckley and his magazine viewed American Jews and the treatment of them. It's really later in the Cold War, beginning with the 1967 war, and then really changing after the 1973 war, that National Review, Buckley, and American conservatism adopted a very pro-Israel stance. So yes, they were successful during that time, and then along different measures. And judging their success now, I think we can say that along the pro-Israel measure, that success has been sustained. That the conservative movement in the main, the Republican Party in the main, still supports Israel wholeheartedly. On the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic prejudices seeping into conservative thought and writing, I think we are becoming less successful. And I think that the new media age that we have entered, where everyone is a publisher, where there isn't an editor or an editor as powerful as William F. Buckley Jr. to kind of impose standards of behavior and conduct and discourse, has allowed more anti-Semitic tropes emerge in certain spaces of the right. It's not mainstream in the American conservative movement yet, but it's something that I find quite alarming when you look at some of these podcasters, social media personalities.
So, Haley, you're a recent graduate of Hillsdale, one of the great epicenters of young conservative formation. What was the feeling there? Meaning, among the young conservatives that you went to school with, are they in the Zionist, Buckley, no tolerance for anti-Semitism camp? Or is it more complicated?
I think it's more complicated, and I think it goes back to what Matt was mentioning about the new media age. Especially, there are many young conservatives who listen to the most famous podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan, and Ruth and I made co-chair the Douglas Murray fan club here because the episode he did on Rogan was so good. He was calling out anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. But one of the things he said, which kind of became an internet meme, went very viral, was, well, have you been there? Have you been to Israel? Have you seen what's happening on the ground? Because only when you see what's happening on the ground can you be some voice of authority. And I think that the problem is before October 7th, and I graduated in 2023, so I graduated before October 7th, before conservatives on Hillsdale's campus had a big chance to talk about Israel. I think that before October 7th, in classes we spoke very highly about Pat Buchanan, which is of course the subject that Buckley addresses in his book. And I can say that no discussion of Buchanan's anti-Semitic strain came up in classes, which was concerning for me. And especially now that the new media has captured many people, many young people on the right into believing some of the anti-Semitic tropes, into listening to people like Joe Rogan, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson especially. I mean, these are the new media fan clubs that young people are going toward, and I don't think it's different on Hillsdale's campus currently in the politics department, but I do think there's a wide range of diversity of conservative thought there.
So, Ruth, you've powerfully defined anti-Semitism as the organization of politics against the Jews. And so, even as we think about there are places in the right where, there may be more seduction of the virus and anti-Semitism today than there might have been in previous times. The truth is, of course, it's the left right now that is organizing politics against the Jews. And so how do you diagnose the broader political culture of anti-Semitism, and what have we learned in the last few years where the world's eyes have been so focused?
Well, it's a very troubling question to me, because one of the reasons that anti-Semitism is so misunderstood and that you cannot fault perhaps even Buchanan and some of the old paleo-conservatives for their attitude is because, you'll forgive me, this is too touchy perhaps, but I think very true. We decided that anti-Semitism was Hitlerism. And we decided that the most important thing that we had to tell this country and the world was about the Holocaust and what had happened. And we spent an enormous amount of energy since the 1970s, not immediately after the war, just when things were beginning to become important in terms of the war against Israel. That was when, I think, Jews became ready to think about what they had lost. And they put up not just the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I just read today a very, one of these upbeat emails that comes into your box. Guess what? We're putting up a new Holocaust Museum and it's some town in Indiana or whatever, I don't know where, I don't remember exactly where it is. Great excitement. This was, we have to now face it, a huge mistake that we made. And we are going to have to try to start repositioning why, precisely in terms of your thing. Anti-Semitism is the organization of politics against the Jews. It's a political issue. And it's interesting that Buckley says, for his point of view, it's 90% moral and 10% geopolitical from him. He thought it was a moral issue. Well, it was for him a moral imperative. But anti-Semitism is, I distinguish it from gentlemanly, keeping people out of golf clubs or whatever. And the reason I would do it is this. They kept Jews out of golf clubs when they kept African Americans out of golf clubs, when they kept gays out of golf clubs, when they kept women out of clubs. It was a different era. And the discrimination against Jews, horrible as it was just that, discrimination. It wasn't the organization of politics against them, which is what happened in Germany in the 1870s, but it's also in Marxism. It's at the very root of Marxism. Karl Marx said that the God of the Jews is money, and the anti-capitalist movement from the very beginning was an anti-Jewish movement. And the left is against the Jews, that is to say the communist left is against the Jews essentially, because what is that communist left? It is internationalist and it is secular, and the Jews are the worst combination. They are both a nation, an indissoluble nation, and a religion. So in terms of the communist world, it was like the double negative. If Jews wanted a state, if they wanted Zionism, they were going backwards in history. Everybody else is going forward in history into the great international, and here are the Jews taking us backward in history. So by putting up all this thing about Hitler, just when the communist anti-Zionism was getting stronger and stronger and stronger, including in America, number one. And then secondly, even before the war, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood had been created and was becoming very powerful in the pogroms in Palestine. So you had the two major movements of anti-Semitism, Islamism and Pan-Arabism united in anti-Semitism, and the left united in anti-Semitism. And these movements are the ones which came into power starting in 1945, at the very moment when the one form of anti-Semitism that had been most powerful was crushed. And I have to say that, of course, I'm worried about what you are both pointing out, very worried. But the other side of it is that fascism is the only thing that you can rely on to be the villainy. If you look at television, or you look at the movies or something, and the worst programs, if you want to make sure that there's a villain that everyone will understand it's a villain, you dress him in black, you dress him in Nazi-type uniform, or Vader, or whatever, That's what villainy is to this country. I don't think you can ever have wonderfully resolute, resurgence of the fascist right waving, I haven't seen one such thing on a campus, and I've been on many campuses. I think you would agree, right? We do not see these great fascist movements. So partly, I think what we have to do is we have to understand that we have to reinterpret anti-Semitism as being a political movement. And it certainly is that. Through the United Nations, of all things, the United Nations, the great liberal bastion, it was seized to become the main Nuremberg of anti-Semitism for our time.
So, Matt, we've all watched with horror and dismay the protests, the radicalism, the turn against the Jews in America on the campuses. At a surface level, it seems so obviously strange that, the LGBTQ activists and the radical kind of postmodern left are standing alongside the Hamasniks, calling for the destruction of Tel Aviv. What is it that has brought these two groups together? Can you say a little bit more about this perverse ideological marriage of the radical left and of the Islamist anti-American?
Well, I think Ruth described the historical roots of this phenomenon very well. I think what brings these two groups together is what brings most coalitions together, and that is a shared enemy. And so with any coalition, it's often a convenient relationship. Islamism, and Pan-Arabism, of course, hate the Jews and hate the existence of Israel for as long as Israel will exist, before Israel existed. And the left opposes Israel because of this moment I alluded to in my first response, this moment in 1967, when the Soviet Union turned against the state of Israel. Of course, the Soviet Union had been kind of mildly supportive when Zionism was understood as an anti-colonial enterprise, as an anti-British enterprise. In the early days of the Jewish state, the Soviets were ambivalent best, but in 1967 is the turn. In the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union backed the Arabs fully. And then in the Yom Kippur War, of course, the world came to the brink of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union over the invasion of Israel and Israel's successful defeat of the Arab armies. So that common threat has long-standing philosophical roots, as we pointed out, but also a closer historical, political root. Now, so why Israel, right? Why does Israel always have the focus of attention? It's a very small country, right? Geographically, population, it punches above its weight, of course, in terms of its economy, but still, why would what's happening in Israel motivate such violence and vandalism, destruction on American campuses and in city streets thousands of miles away? When the Syrian civil war had no such effect on our campuses, when the occupation of Tibet or the Xinjiang province, slave labor in China has no motivating force on America's campuses, when Iranian human rights violations or the human rights violations of any dozens of members of the Arab League has no such effect on our campuses. One is left with no other explanation but anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, not just as a political dogma, but as kind of a pedagogy, something that has been taught. We now have generation of universities where the faculties that have selected themselves are steeped in left-wing, postmodern, anti-colonial, anti-Zionist thought. And so when you combine that with the rise of foreign students in America's universities, including America's most prestigious universities, I must confess to you all, I was shocked to find out that Harvard is not the top Ivy in terms of foreign students. That would be my alma mater, a Broadway, Columbia, which is almost 50% foreign students. And then you wonder why Columbia was the site of the Intifada. So you have this toxic stew that has been brewing, and October 7th and October 8th was when a match was lit.
So, Haley, one of the things you've written about is the Christian response to October 7th. And as we step back and think about this political and civilizational moment, on the one hand, it's an amazing moment of friendship between Jews and Christians, and where religious Christians have a kind of belief in and attachment to, devotion to, not only Israel, but the deeper cause of the Jewish people than at any moment in history. Yet there's also some reason to worry that that support is softening and weakening, and that the kind of ideology of, the Jew as oppressor has seeped in a little bit among younger Christians. What have you seen in your reporting? What did you see on the ground as a student?
In younger traditional Catholic circles, I think the danger of anti-Semitism is a little more present, which doesn't make much sense to someone like me who's a big fan of JP2. I'm a Catholic convert, and JP2 reiterated what the church put forth under Pope, was it the fourth? Yeah, Pope Paul IV? But Pope Paul and Pope JP2, they both reaffirmed that Christians have a great duty to Jews as God's elect people. They also reaffirmed the fact that, just because Jews are of a different religion doesn't mean that Catholics should treat them any differently. And I think right now in traditional Catholic circles, there is a bit of the, and I hate to keep ragging on him, but I will here, but the Tucker Carlson strain, the Candace Owens strain of using a phrase like Christ is King, which if you are a Christian or Catholic or anything, you believe that's true. You believe that's true. But to say the phrase Christ is King as a guise of anti-Semitism has become a little bit more popular. And I think just to go back to what we've been seeing on college campuses, I've been disappointed about the response of Republican groups on campus, even though many of them have been good, but also the usually more ecumenical Christian groups. I think there have been some very good programs sponsored by people like Tikvah or the Philos Project, or people who really are grassroots on campuses and who have planted seeds there for years and for decades, where the Christian-Jewish alliance is extremely strong. But past that, past those very few small groups in which people in this room have invested time into, past that, there hasn't been much backlash. When Jews at UCLA and Berkeley are blocked off from going to school, there's no Christian mob coming to help them. And I think that this is a great time for us to reaffirm why that's so important and why we need each other.
I think it's impossible to try to make sense of a political moment without thinking about Trump and Trumpism. I'm curious, Ruth, Matt, what do you make sense of Trump's effect on how conservatives think about Israel, about the Jews, about these fights? He is in his own way an incredibly complex figure on these things. What do you think is shaping his way of thinking? A dangerous game if anyone wants to play it. And at a deeper level, how do you think Trumpism has shaped the conservative mind as it relates to Israel and Jewish people? Ruth is very wise. She knows that she's going to kick that over to the great historian, and she'd rather get back over that.
So I think in tracing Donald Trump's political career so far, 10 years now, it was very important for him politically to distinguish himself from Patrick Buchanan, from the subject of this Buckley book we're talking about, from the three-time presidential candidate, twice as a Republican, once as the Reform Party candidate in 2000. Buchanan, having had that reputation for anti-Semitic rhetoric and obsession with Jewish influence on America's foreign policy, also had many ideas, preferences that Trump shared. So Justice Buchanan spoke of America first in the 1990s, calling back to Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement opposing American intervention in World War II. Donald Trump talked about how he was America first in 2015 and 2016. Pat Buchanan in 1992, and then much more harshly in 1996, focused on illegal immigration. Donald Trump, there's one issue we associate with Donald Trump, it's opposition to illegal immigration. Pat Buchanan, beginning in 1992, 1996, as a Republican, was a trade protectionist, believed in tariffs, wrote a very thick book called The Great Betrayal, all about the case for tariffs. Trump, of course, is a protectionist. But what was the difference between Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump? It was support for the state of Israel and outreach and solidarity with the American Jewish community. Now, I'm not about to guess at what the motives were for that difference. They could be personal, they could be sentimental, they could be geopolitical, but on sheer campaign politics, this was essential. Because the most important group in the Republican Party are Christian evangelical voters. And for the Christian evangelical community, for decades, and this is a separate story than the Buckley National Review story, but among the evangelical Christian community, Israel is top of mind, as our former press secretary might say. It is, if not the most important issue, number two. And so when you saw Donald Trump talk about his support for Israel in the campaign in 2016 to these crowds, when you saw him address AIPAC, I think that when the history of the Trump era is written, that speech he gave to AIPAC in 2016 will be a turning point. It was at the MCI Center, the Verizon Center, the basketball arena in Washington, D.C. The crowd was crazy. It was quite an event when he gave the speech, saying how much he supported Israel, pledging to move the embassy to Jerusalem, opposing the Iran deal as the worst deal in history. This was critical to his success in the Republican primary, and then helped him again in 2016. What I find interesting about Trump, too, as it's playing out, and we're still very early, is that in critical issues, he seems to have decided to repudiate his first term. And if you look at, say, tariffs, for example, in the first term, tariffs were focused on China. He renegotiated NAFTA, that's what he pledged to do. Once that was done and we had the USMCA, all the tariffs were on China. This time, we get Liberation Day. We get a tariff on everybody. Highest tariffs in America since the Great Depression. Judges, for a rock grip conservative like myself, Trump's judicial legacy will be his longest lasting and perhaps his most important legacy. Well, what did he do 2 weeks ago? He declared war on Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. And even though a few of his judicial nominations are high quality candidates that the bench memos gurus at NR celebrate, he also nominated his personal attorney, who is now at the Justice Department, Emil Bove, to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which means he'll probably nominate Bove to the Supreme Court if the vacancy arrives. And then there's foreign policy. The foreign policy of Donald Trump's first term, I believe, was extraordinarily successful. But when I look at his foreign policy as it's happening in the second term, I have real concerns. In particular on this question of support for the state of Israel and opposition to the existential threat to Israel, which is the Iranian nuclear bomb. A lot, of course, is happening as we speak. We don't know how this will be resolved. One thinks that Trump's kind of instinctual belief in peace through strength and in a strong America that has its way and that won't let other countries embarrass us will lead him to make the right decisions in the coming months. But if you ask me if there's one thing that I think most distinguishes the first term Trump from the second term Trump, it is this critical issue of foreign policy which relates to the subjects that we're discussing. I should also say, when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism and the supporters of Hamas in the United States, he has been unwavering. And I happen to believe that you can quibble with the way he's doing it, but what he's doing, in my view, is absolutely necessary and absolutely essential if we're going to combat the political organization of hatred toward Jews, which is institutionalized on the left in a way that it is not institutionalized on the right today.
So I want to try to take as many questions as we can from all of you. Alex, there are cards, right, floating around. Are those supposed to make their way to me, or? Okay. So I'll ask you an easy question, Ruth, while I'm waiting for the cards, and challenge you to answer it succinctly. Is America still fundamentally different? Meaning, is there something in the DNA of the American Republic, and the soul of the American project, that will always, even if it tolerates little turn-ups of anti-Semitism, will always ultimately keep that strand that was so destructive of European civilization down?
I guess that's the most serious question of all, because the subject of anti-Semitism, when you raise it, as we're doing here in this joint project with the National Review and with the subject of conservatism, is really about America. And I think that what's important to realize, this is not just the trouble, it's not just something that we say because we want to comfort ourselves. The war against Israel is not a war against Israel, just as the war against the Jews was not really so much about the Jews, as I've said. Anti-Semitism is about the anti-Semites. It has nothing to do with the Jews. The Jews are whatever is projected on them. And it is a terrible ideology, movement of grievance and blame. It always corrupts the society that seizes on it. You will never find a case where there was a polity, a movement, a king, anyone who was against the Jews, who was, quote, on the right side of history. The people who stand against the Jews are always on the wrong side of history. And that would require a seminar to show why it is so. I'm just summing it up, and I think you can, maybe you don't have to trust me on this, but think about it. And so what you're asking really is the question of whether America becomes anti-Israel or anti-Jewish is a question about America. And our obligation here is really to prevent that from happening, not just because we care about the future of the Jews, which of course is our passion and our entire life. It's about this country, because it's a terrible movement of grievance and blame. And in the universities, at least in the university that I saw emerging, let me just say, do you remember when I got to Harvard in 1993? You know the first thing I did? I organized 2 conferences. One in 96, 97 on the 100th anniversary of Zionism, a huge conference on the anniversary of Zionism. Half the conference was in Cambridge, the other half was in Israel, in Jerusalem. It was fantastic. Huge 3 days, wonderful. The second conference was on the 50th anniversary of Commentary magazine. Can you believe this? This was 1993. So when you think of what happened between 1993 and today, where all the grievance groups at Harvard and at every university, it's the grievance movements, the anti-capitalist movement, the anti-patriarchy movement, the anti-colonialist movement, the white supremacy movement. And then, as I put it, these are all kind of abstractions. You're against patriarchy. Who is he? What is it? You're against colonialism. What is it? But then come the Palestinians who have been working this up, and of course the whole Arab world has created them to play this role. They come and they say, we are the flag of your grievance movement. Oh, suddenly there it is, all of it. And that's why they're so excited and they're so wonderfully keen. But what is that grievance movement? It's about America. It's against America, what America really is, what it stands for, the complexities of a democratic government and a democratic society. So I would say that the subject, ultimately, that we're dealing with here is your question. And it had better come out in the affirmative. But that's what we're here to fight for. That's our job as citizens. But I do think that these two things cannot be separated. If America gives in to anti-Semitism in any form, and now the only form of anti-Semitism is Israel, of course. Anti-Semitism has become anti-Zionism. There is no other form of anti-Semitism that is significant. It is all anti-Zionism. If it turns that way, I don't see America surviving.
Okay. We've got a lot of interesting questions. We'll try to do the lightning round here and get as many of it as we can. I have to answer questions. Ruth, first one's back to you. If we've wasted all this money on Holocaust museums and Holocaust education, what specifically should we replace it with?
It's a very, very good question. I think that, at Tikvah, we replace it with many things. I think that, classical education, but I think that what we have to do is we have to reinforce the good, for one thing. One has to reinforce what we owe this country, why it is so exceptional, why the Jews are exceptional. And if you're going to have a Holocaust museum that is dedicated to the negative, then it should include the history of anti-Semitism. In other words, at some point or other, the Holocaust Museum can either include Islamism and Pan-Arabism, all forms of anti-Semitism, and communist anti-Semitism. It has got to expand that way, or it can expand the way the Passover story expands. And that's the example that I would always use. Passover story begins, we were slaves in Egypt. And half the Holocaust Museum can be how horrible it was, slaves. But the great thing that the Jews accomplished in the 1940s, I would say, the miracle of miracles, in the 1940s, the same decade in which 1/3 of the Jewish people was exterminated, that the Holocaust shows in such magnitude, the Jews recovered their sovereignty in the state of Israel, which had been under foreign occupation for 2,000 years. You want to tell a story to America? You want American school children to come and learn something? Well, that is an American story. That's a story that's like, nobody could make it up. It's beyond anything. And I must say that, I'm not a Christian. And the idea of Christ's rising after 3 days is very compelling in a way. But I think that we should also say that the Jewish people arose after 3 years from the ashes, literally. 3 years, from 1945 to 1948. Now, this is our story. We have told that to America, and instead of that, we invite them to come and watch how the Nazis succeeded in their task. You see that if you look at it in a certain way, it does seem very odd, and I think it can be changed. And I think that if it changes, it can be so inspiring.
So I think these two are related and open to any of you. If a large majority of American Jews suffer from Stockholm Syndrome, What does the minority do to organize and fight back? And then the second variant is, how can liberal Jews, the word liberal underlined, be encouraged to affirm the strength of their peoplehood without resorting to counterproductive politics and greed?
Well, I'll take the first one on what a creative minority can do. The first is that people are not without resources, and so prioritization of certain goals, whether it is securing Jewish communities and sites in the United States, whether it's furthering Jewish education, which is very important, so that young Jews don't leave the community after even if they have a bar mitzvah. I was very struck by this recent population survey that came out just this past week, showing that the Jewish population has grown. Israel has grown. Israel will be the site of the most Jews within a decade, I think. It would be the largest center. Mainly because American Jewry is slowly vanishing. And they had to revise the number down of American Jews because it just didn't, the meaning of being a Jew in America is very tenuous and has been for some time. So I think we need to rebuild Jewish community, and I think you do that not through social justice politics, which has been the response of most Jewish organizations, but you do it through education, real education, and bolstering Jewish communal habits. And then also you find allies. Maybe you don't like your allies. Maybe your allies are Christian, and maybe sometimes your Christian allies say something that is kind of ignorant or prejudiced. But you know what? If they're on your side in fighting these terrible threats to your community, put up with it and do it, even if it's not what you're used to or it makes you slightly uncomfortable. So those would be the two things that I suggest.
Should we go to the next one, or you want to share? Okay. I'll only add quickly on this that I do think there's been, since October 7th, a bit of an awakening among American Jews. Now, whether they'll be mugged by reality and press charges, as the famous expression goes, and they actually change their way of thinking about this. I also recall the great line, which I don't say in celebration, but I think was deeply insightful. One of the last things that the great Jewish intellectual Milton Himmelfarb wrote in commentary is that the future of American Jewry is, quote, fewer but better Jews. I don't think that's a note of celebration, but I do think the better part could be real, and there could be a kind of renaissance of American Jewry that is both believes in Jewish exceptionalism and is realist about politics. Okay, let's take one or two more. When National Review and Buckley parted ways with Joe Subran, it hurt his career in a real way. When Fox let Tucker go and the Daily Wire split with Candace Owens, they only grew in influence. How can we fight political anti-Semitism when it's no longer possible to marginalize anyone?
Well, that's what Fox, I don't think sunk because of Tucker Carlson's leaving it, and I think that the people who watch Fox would not have stayed with it had he stayed with the network. So I'm not sure to what extent that is marginalization, but I think what Haley is saying is right, that obviously there's a new, the social media phenomenon and the populist phenomenon, or whatever you call it. There's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction in this country. And that dissatisfaction is going somewhere, and these people are appealing to it. Now, when I say a grievance movement, many of these people who feel aggrieved, you can't come to them very easily and say, look, you have nothing to be aggrieved about. You have to find ways of dealing with it. But one thing that Buckley points out in this book that is true, he said, you don't win by calling everybody an anti-Semite. what he was doing was also warning the Jews about their tactics. It doesn't work, to call everyone out. I think I would ask, what's the most effective thing that Jews have done in teaching others about themselves, and especially about Israel? What is the good news about this country? I mean, the fact is that Israel is a tremendous resource, a tremendous ally, a tremendous inspiration. How come we cannot get that across? How come there isn't a single filmmaker, except non-Jewish filmmakers, who will make the story of King David, who will tell the story of the Exodus? Do you realize that all those films are made by non-Jews? The great Jewish films that the Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks about, the Jewish writers, they don't write the great story. So I think that to go out and just hooray, you have to emphasize the good and the great. And we have to emphasize now that Israel has won now the most spectacular war. I mean, there are people, generals here in the United States, who are writing about this all the time. Do you know what the IDF has accomplished in Gaza? No one has ever fought a war like that. Every American unit can learn from what they have done well and what they have done maybe not so well. It's just amazing. And some of us know it. We know the heroism. We know we know how they've cleared out Lebanon, and we know at what cost. But we know what amazing things they've done. Nothing of that gets across. So, there's you hardly know where to start in correcting all the wrong and in emphasizing all that one can do.
So I'll ask one last question and give each of you a chance to weigh in, and then we'll come to closure. What should be the message on anti-Semitism going forward from a conservative point of view? Haley, Matt, and Ruth.
I feel like we should start with our resident.
I have a question for you, Haley, that's related to it. It's in your experience in college and then just out of college, when you encounter young people on the right who may be tempted by some of this nastiness that we're talking about, does anything change their minds? Have you seen people maybe being pulled in one direction, but then over time they're turned toward the light? And if so, how can we build on that?
I was just thinking about this as Ruth was speaking, because it just came out from the New York Times. The Democrats are embarking on a $20 million campaign to figure out how to speak to young men, how to draw young men back into the party. And one of the things that was so incredible that hasn't lived long enough, I mean, among these circles it certainly has, but was the pager tech. I mean, certainly on the right, some friends who were tempted by anti-Semitism, some conservative friends, saw that and thought, oh my God, the IDF is incredible. Let me look into this, let me research it, let me look at podcasts on all of this. I mean, they geeked out about it for months, and they still sort of are. But another thought that comes to mind is short of providing, every young conservative tempted, which is again what Tikvah and programs like this will do, short of providing them with a trip to Israel where they can see for themselves what a miraculous state the Jewish people have created, truly miraculous. Short of doing that, inviting students into your homes for Shabbat dinners was one of the greatest experiences I could have ever received as a young Christian. Hearing about just familial ties among Jewish people in America and the ties they have back to the state of Israel. It's really impactful. And I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, because another thing that the right needs to do desperately is meet young people where they are, which is social media. Which is unfortunately where people and voices who are a little more questionable on this issue tend to do very well. So we need to meet them where we're at, but I think the most effective thing that we can do is talk to young people. And yeah, I would say once you explain that the numbers coming out of Gaza are in fact fabricated by Hamas, that's really the one thing that immediately turns the tide for young conservatives. The one thing. And then we go from there.
So I would just say, the first is stand your ground. Right? We cannot allow the Intifada in the United States to change our behavior or our identity as Jews, especially those of us who are visibly Jewish in our clothing. That cannot be allowed to happen. You can secure facilities, you can protect communities, but cannot make it an embarrassment to be a Jew in the United States. That line cannot be crossed. So that's part one. And then part two is we must impose costs for anti-Semitism. We must crack down. It is not simply a matter of bemoaning this phenomenon or saying now's the time for dialogue or how do we change hearts and minds. I've never been interested in changing hearts and minds, and I'm a pundit. We need to impose costs, and that means the ruthless application of the rule of law, even if it means screwing up Harvard University's faculty plans for a couple of years.
You had the good wisdom to leave Harvard and come to Tikvah, so we'll give you the near last part.
I don't want the last word, actually. No, I think that what Matt said is right. We don't exact any cost. And this is what we, as Jews, you see, we don't know how to do that because our MO, we want to live among the nations. We're a minority by choice. We have no incentive for attacking. We have no incentive for counterattacking. All we want is acceptance from the people who attack us. So we are very, very bad at exacting any cost from anyone. This is fatal. So I have a whole list of why the Jews are chosen as the #1 no-fail target, but that is one of them. If you make yourself an easy target, there's no price to be paid for attacking you. And everybody can get into it and enjoy it as much as they want, and you know that you're not going to suffer any harm. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you join? So I think that that's what Buckley did for us in a sense. He made people pay. If you would that, and that's what I think that, for example, Harvard, I would say that the first time that Harvard closes the divinity school, closes the school, and Columbia closes its school, fires all the people that are in it because they cannot say that. If you start doing that, and you know that you just can't get away with hatred as a policy, it will begin to change things.
I'll just offer two brief final thoughts before we adjourn. Look, we all believe that ideas matter, why we're here. But I would say in the current moment, what matters much more is courage. I think what we have to impart to young Jews, young Americans, young Christian friends of the Jews is the courage to stand before the tide of anti-Semitism, yelling, stop. And I'll just say, Ruth, at a personal level, you are an embodiment of that Jewish courage that we need. And now I'm going to show a little courage, though, by ending by disagreeing with you, which is terrifying, but I'm going to try. Of course, I mostly agree with everything you said, and surely the point that anti-Semitism is fundamentally about the anti-Semites, their grievances, their ideology, their projects, their perversions is right. But I do think we have to reckon with the fact that they've chosen the Jews as the tool of their political projects, and I think it's worth thinking about why. Because I do think, in some deep way, anti-Semitism is the inversion of Jewish exceptionalism. Anti-Semitism is an inversion of Jewish chosenness. And if you go back to that letter that Strauss wrote to National Review, his point is that there is no greater exemplification of the conservative way of understanding the human condition than Israel and the Jewish people. Right? A people that believe in the wisdom of tradition, that adhere to their particular attachments, that defend them under duress, that are realistic about the human condition, and that have brought the majesty of the Bible and the biblical vision of man to the world. So why do Christians, why do conservatives, why do they love Israel? It's because Jerusalem is the moral capital of the past. And if we can't teach that story, the heroism and the majesty and the remarkable achievements of the Jewish people in history, as Jews to our own people, and then to an America that I think needs that message now more than ever, then we haven't done our part. And so I would end with a summons to the Jews among us that we owe something to America to reinvigorate it with our own heroic and Hebraic spirit. And if we don't do that, we failed at our mission. That's our purpose at this moment in history. Ruth, Matt, Haley, thank you.